The building in Alhambra, California, that housed Steens Incorporated through most of the 1960s, has long since been reclaimed by the industrial sprawl that defines the eastern edge of Los Angeles County warehouse districts, auto body shops, the light industrial corridor that runs through the San Gabriel Valley without distinguishing itself or apologizing for what it is. Alhambra sits 9 miles from downtown Los Angeles, close enough to feel the city's gravity, far enough to have its own modest ambitions. And it is precisely the kind of place where a man living out of a delivery truck in 1960 could, with 2 weeks and a few phone calls, build the foundation of something that would put America's children on motorized vehicles for the first time. The machines that John Steen's company made between 1963 and 1971 were called tacos, the taquito, the burrito, the frijol. The naming convention was deliberate, playful, and inexplicable in every other sense. Steen was not of Mexican heritage, the machines had no connection to Mexican culture, and the word taco appears to have been selected partly because a patent application required a name and something had to be printed in the catalog. What the catalog actually needed was something that would stick in the mind of a 12-year-old boy, and taco accomplished that with a specificity that minicycle or trail bike could not. The Taco was the biggest and most thoroughly named minibike manufacturer of the 1960s, shipping machines by the thousands from Southern California, sold through Steen's catalog operation and independent dealers, to the backyards and dirt fields and storm drain banks of post-war suburban America. The machine itself was specific, a rigid tubular steel frame, bent and welded at angles that gave it a low, crouched silhouette, the seat barely 2 feet off the ground. The elevated handlebars swept back toward the rider in a configuration that put the throttle at the natural height of a child's reaching hand. A Tecumseh or Briggs & Stratton 4-stroke flathead engine of 3 to 5 horsepower bolted horizontally in the frame, its pull-start cord hanging off to the side, a centrifugal clutch that engaged automatically as the engine revved, no gear changes, no clutch lever, no instruction required beyond the basic physics of sitting and throttling. You pulled the cord, the engine caught, and you twisted the grip and went. The sound, a specific mechanical buzzing, not quite the sound of a lawnmower at work, but exactly the sound of a lawnmower engine doing different work, carrying a person rather than cutting grass. The distinction between utility and freedom expressed entirely in vibration and speed. The Taco weighed approximately 65 pounds. A 10-year-old could carry one. A 12-year-old who had saved paper route money for 3 months could own one. Then, the Honda Z50A, arriving in American showrooms in 1968 with a 4.9 cubic centimeter overhead cam engine, a 3-speed semi-automatic transmission, telescopic front forks, and a reputation for engineering precision that made the Taco's Briggs & Stratton flathead look like what it was, a lawn implement pressed into recreational service. The Kawasaki Coyote, which followed Honda's lead with similar sophistication at competitive prices. The flood of Japanese-designed machines that the late 1960s delivered to American dealers, each one more capable and more refined than the last, each one making the proposition of a rigid-frame, lawnmower-engined American minibike incrementally less defensible against the math. Steen's company, which had never been purely a minibike manufacturer, pivoted to motorcycle distribution, to synthetic oil, to Japanese marques, to the diversified catalog business that had always been its foundation. The Taco line ended sometime around 1971. The exact circumstances are not entirely documented. This is a story about how specificity of vision became irrelevance, about how a machine that defined the exact boundary between the backyard and the street, between the child's world and the adult world, between the lawnmower and the motorcycle, was displaced precisely because it had defined that boundary so well that it had no room left to grow. Not one failure, a decade of decisions that were correct for the moment and insufficient for what followed. A delivery truck and 2 weeks to get a business running. The confirmed facts about John Steen. He was a Southern California off-road motorcycle racer of accomplishment in the late 1950s, running alongside Bud Ekins and Cliff Coleman in the early West Coast desert racing scene. He was acquainted with Steve McQueen, who moved in the same circles. He was involved with the go-kart manufacturing company, which leased a 5-acre facility in Azusa from Aerojet General Corporation. He invented Steen's C, the first 100% synthetic motor oil. He raced at the 1,964 International 6 Days Trial in East Germany as part of the first American team to contest that event, alongside McQueen, Bud and Dave Ekins, and Cliff Coleman. And he built the first taco minibikes in early 1963 from a facility in Alhambra, with help from photographer and designer Lynn Wineland. Around 1960, Steen was living out of a delivery truck he also drove for work. Friends who operated a business in Alhambra were relocating and had 2 weeks remaining on their lease. They offered Steen the space if he could establish a business in that time. He called in favors from the racing and hot rod world, pulled together consignment parts, and set up as a specialty retailer of racing components and his Steen's C synthetic oil. The catalog that followed Steen's Incorporated would grow into a 128-page document encompassing taco minibikes, go-kart parts, Rickman Métis scrambler frame kits, Seriani forks and shocks, and Hodaka motorcycle components. The racing career had already left its mark on the product. Steen's crash in the late 1950s, catastrophic enough to force a temporary end to his competition, gave him years of watching and thinking rather than riding. He knew what a motorcycle frame needed to do when asked to absorb punishment across rough terrain. He knew the difference between a machine that would survive the enthusiasm of an inexperienced rider and a machine that would not. The taco's frame bent, welded, specific in its geometry was not the thinnest available interpretation of the minibike concept. It was the interpretation of someone who had spent time thinking about what a small machine needed to survive contact with children. The name came later. Patent applications required names. What they settled on, whether it was Steen's Choice, Wineland's, or simply the nearest word to hand, the record does not say, was taco and its successors, the taquito, the burrito, the frijol. The naming logic has not survived in the documentation. What survived is the name itself, which proved to be exactly the kind of word that 8-year-olds remember and repeat. The industrial ecosystem that made them possible. To understand what John Steen built and why it mattered, it is necessary to understand Southern California in 1960, not the Southern California of beaches and film studios, but the Southern California of aerospace manufacturing, hot rod culture, and the industrial infrastructure that supported both. The San Gabriel Valley, running east of Los Angeles through Alhambra, Azusa, and Monrovia, was in 1960 a manufacturing district of considerable density. Aerojet General, whose facility in Azusa the go-kart manufacturing company leased, was an aerospace contractor. The foundries and machine shops and metalworking operations that surrounded these larger employers provided exactly the subcontracting ecosystem that a small vehicle manufacturer needed. The hot rod and custom car culture of Southern California had been generating mechanical talent since the late 1940s. Rod and Custom, the magazine for which Lynn Wineland worked as photographer and later as editor, documented and spread this culture nationally. The men who built hot rods built them in garages with basic tools and specific knowledge: metalworking, engine theory, what a frame needed to hold together at speed, not formally trained engineers in most cases. Enthusiasts who had educated themselves through doing, positioned when the go-kart craze arrived because the skills transferred. The go-kart was the immediate precursor to the minibike, and Steen's involvement with the go-kart manufacturing company gave him both a view of the market and a cautionary example. The go-kart company had grown quickly from a muffler shop to a 5-acre leased facility in Azusa, then overextended financially and went bankrupt. Steen drew the appropriate conclusion. The minibike market, in the early 1960s, had far fewer manufacturers than the go-kart market. He was a motorcyclist rather than a racing driver. The two-wheeled machine was the natural expression of his instincts. Lynn Wineland's contribution to the taco's identity was the color. Wineland owned a 1932 Ford Roadster that he had painted metallic purple to distinguish it from other roadsters at car shows. When Steen was preparing his first mini-bikes for production, Wineland suggested using the surplus purple paint from the Roadster. Gold had been the planned color, practical, uncontroversial, suited to a catalog illustration. Wineland's metallic purple was something else. It was the color of a machine that did not want to be mistaken for a tool. The taco's signature metallic purple, which became a trade characteristic so consistent that collectors today identify unpainted or repainted examples by the absence of it, originated in the bottom of a paint can that had been mixed for a 1932 Ford at a California car show. The go-kart fire and what came after. The culture from which the taco emerged was born at a specific moment. The summer of 1960, when Lynn Wineland, still working at Rod and Custom, placed a full-page advertisement announcing the first major West Coast mini-cycle race. The event was called the Tiny Bear, named after the Big Bear Scrambler race, and it was held at Vincent Junction off California Highway 14. Rod and Custom ran a full story on the race in their October 1960 issue. Mickey Rupp came from Ohio to compete. Duffy Livingston was there, Tom Person, Chuck Swanson. The people who would, over the following decade, define what the American minibike industry became. In July 1960, a race of small motorized bicycles built not by manufacturers but by enthusiasts from lawnmower engines and welded tubing drew enough participants and spectators that Rod and Custom found it worth a full feature. The go-kart craze of the late 1950s had demonstrated that a new category of recreational, motorized vehicle, small and cheap and operable by people who would never aspire to a full motorcycle, could find a market. The Tiny Bear demonstrated that this market had an identity, a community, a set of shared enthusiasms that could be focused and organized. The minibike had found its people before the minibike manufacturers had found their products. John Steen watched this process from inside the go-kart world and concluded around 1962 or 1963 that the time was right to build a machine. The minibike market had far fewer competitors than the go-kart market, which had dozens of manufacturers competing in a space that was already defined. The minibike market was still forming. He was a motorcycle man, not a kart racer, and Steen's Sea synthetic oil had earned him a reputation in a community that was about to develop a significant appetite for products like his. In early 1963, the first taco minibike went into production. The frame came from Steen's own design, informed by his racing background and constrained by production costs and the practical realities of shipping a rigid tubular structure through the mail. The engine came from whoever was supplying the market at that moment: Tecumseh, Briggs & Stratton, Clinton, all producing small horizontal crankshaft flathead four-strokes in the 3 to 5 horsepower range that the minibike format required. The catalog listed variations, different rim options, different engine displacements, different suspension configurations for buyers who wanted more than the rigid frame standard. The first taco wore gold paint. Then it wore metallic purple. The machine, at full speed, hold a taco frijole, the marque's most fully developed expression. A mini-bike that by the late 1960s had evolved through multiple iterations into something that represented the genre at its best, before the genre was displaced, and what you feel is the specific weight of ambition at 65 pounds. Not heavy, not trivial. The weight of a thing designed to be carried by a child and maintained by a child, where maintained meant adding oil when the dipstick indicated it was needed and adjusting the chain tension by loosening 2 bolts and sliding the rear axle back in its frame slots. The frame was tubular steel, welded at joints that show the hand of someone who understood that a minibike led a brutal life dropped, ridden through ditches, launched off homemade ramps, ridden by two people simultaneously. The tubes were bent and compressed at specific points, a manufacturing signature the Revival Company's founder would later note when describing what made an authentic taco different from the imitators. The smashed tubes were the same. The geometry was the same. The frame was not elegant. It was honest. The Tecumseh engine bolted to the frame's lower cradle, its horizontal crankshaft pointing to the right, its pull-start mechanism projecting forward. A single cylinder of perhaps 100 to 150 cc in flathead configuration, producing approximately 5 horsepower, consuming fuel at a rate that made a half-gallon tank sufficient for an afternoon's riding. The centrifugal clutch sat on the engine's output shaft, engaging automatically when the engine reached approximately 1,800 revolutions per minute, driving a roller chain to the rear sprocket. No gearbox, no clutch lever, no neutral. The machine was either at idle or at throttle. The sound was the sound of 30 million American summer afternoons. The Tecumseh's particular flathead voice, not a roar, not a whine, but a mechanical insistence operating somewhere between 3,500 and 5,000 revolutions per minute depending on load and throttle position, was the defining audio signature of the era, in the same way that the ice cream, truck's chime, or the sound of a screen door closing defined other aspects of the same summers. Children who grew up in American suburbs between 1963 and 1971 heard this sound coming from the field behind the school, from the neighbor's driveway, from the dirt road beside the storm drain. They knew what it was without being told. They moved toward it. The maximum speed of a taco frajole in standard configuration was approximately 25 to 30 miles per hour. This was, for a 10-year-old on a machine that sat 12 inches off the ground, very fast. It was also, by any adult standard, modest. The gap between those two framings of the same number, 25 miles per hour is fast, 25 miles per hour is modest, was the commercial space the taco occupied. Its audience experienced 25 miles per hour with the visceral intensity of someone going 75, because the seat was so low that the ground passing beneath it blurred, and because the rigid frame transmitted every rut and root and pebble directly into the rider's spine and hands, and because nothing stood between the rider and the consequences of throttle except physics. You twisted the throttle, and the machine went. The complexity was in stopping it, not in making it go. The culture that grew around it. By 1965, the taco was embedded in a specific American subcultural moment that was itself embedded in a larger one. The post-war suburban expansion had produced an America of children. The baby boom's first generation was reaching the age at which motorized recreation became possible and desirable, and those children lived in a physical landscape that was still forming, still full of vacant lots and undeveloped parcels and construction sites and the margins of the built environment that function as the natural habitat of motorized recreation when the adults are not paying attention. The back 40 that the farmer needed the Cushman scooter to check now belonged to the housing developer whose crew had not yet graded it. The minibike found it immediately. The Steen's catalog, which by the mid-1960s ran to 128 pages and encompassed taco minibikes, go-kart components, Rickman Matisse scrambler frame kits, Seriani suspension components, and Hodaka motorcycle parts, was the definitive document of this culture. Popular Mechanics, in June 1967, published plans for building a minibike from scratch, plans that acknowledged the machine's cultural penetration by treating it as a standard DIY project. The go-kart shops and motorcycle dealers and Sears, Roebuck outlets that carried minibikes were, by the late 1960s, doing a business that nobody had entirely anticipated 5 years earlier. The Rupp, built in Mansfield, Ohio by Mickey Rupp's operation, was the taco's primary competitor in terms of market position and cultural footprint. Rupp had been in the mini-bike business since 1962. The Dart Cycle at $199.50, rigid frame and 2.25 horsepower engine, was the machine that defined the Midwestern mini-bike experience in the same period that the Taco defined the Southern California experience. Rupp's Roadster followed with a 5-horsepower Tecumseh and an innovative 2-speed centrifugal clutch. Together, they occupied a market that had, by 1968, grown to include over 100 manufacturers attempting to sell machines through every available channel, from dedicated dealers to the back pages of Popular Mechanics to the Sears catalog. The Southern California Mini-Bike and Kart Association, formed in 1968 and 1969 for children who wanted to race, gave the mini-bike its first organized competitive structure in the region that had birthed the category. Young riders like Wayne Rainey, later a 3-time 500cc Grand Prix world champion, came up through the SCMBKA's race series at tracks like Saddleback Park in Orange County. Rainey's mother, Sandy, famously figured out how to mix nitromethane fuel for his Honda Z50 when the Briggs-powered machines of competitors proved too quick to beat on conventional gasoline. Other SCMBKA alumni included Jeff Ward, who raced to 4 top 10 finishes at the Indianapolis 500. The mini-bike was, for this generation, the first machine, the one that established the relationship between body and engine that all subsequent machines built upon. Steve McQueen, who had ridden with John Steen in the California desert before they went together to East Germany for the 1964 ISDT, was photographed on mini-bikes as naturally as he was photographed on motorcycles. By the mid-1960s, he was the most famous motorcycle rider in America, the star who actually rode rather than merely being associated with riding, and his presence in the same world that produced the Taco gave the category a credibility no advertising could have purchased. When the man who jumped the fence on a Triumph in The Great Escape rode small motorcycles for recreation, small motorcycles became worth wanting. The year that felt like a summit. By 1967 or 1968, the precise peak is difficult to document because Steen Inc. was a private company, and its production records have not survived in accessible form. The Taco was at the center of the largest recreational minibike market in American history. The June 1967 Popular Mechanics, with its build-your-own minibike plans, was a document of cultural saturation. An enthusiast magazine aimed at the mechanically inclined American adult was treating the minibike as a standard household project, which means it had already penetrated deep enough into American culture to seem like a reasonable thing to build in a garage over a weekend. The catalog operation that Steen had built from a 2-week lease had grown into Steen Inc., a multi-product business encompassing the Taco minibikes, the Steen C synthetic oil that had started everything, distribution of Seriani suspension components, Rickman Metis scrambler frame kits, and eventually Hodaka motorcycles, for which Steen became the North American distributor. It was a specialty catalog and distribution operation that had a mini-bike line among its many products, which meant that when the mini-bike market changed, the Taco's fate was not necessarily the company's fate. The models had multiplied through the years. The original Taco of 1963 had been followed by the Taquito, smaller and lighter, aimed at younger children. The Burrito occupied the middle ground. The Frijol was the largest and most capable, approaching the boundary between minibike and small motorcycle without crossing it. The numbering system, Taco 22, Taco 44, Taco 66, indicated frame and engine configurations available as catalog variations, with different rim sizes, different engine displacements, and suspension options from rigid to minimally sprung. The variety reflected a market that was, by 1967, sophisticated enough to have preferences. Then, in 1968, the Honda Z50A arrived in the United States. It arrived quietly through Honda's established dealer network, in a box that could be shipped in the trunk of a car at a price of approximately $250, and it announced, to anyone paying careful attention that the mini-bike category as the Taco had defined it was approaching the end of its natural life. The machine that changed everything. The Honda Z50A had been designed in a version designated Z100 for Tama Tech, an amusement park in Japan owned by Honda, where attractions featured motorsport. The park and safe enough that Honda's liability exposure was manageable. The machine Honda's engineers built for this purpose was exactly right for an application its designers had not anticipated. The American recreational mini-bike market of 1,968. The Z50A's engine was a 4.9 cubic centimeter four-stroke single with an overhead camshaft standard in Honda street machines, but entirely absent from the American mini-bike market, where Briggs & Stratton and Tecumseh flathead engines were universal. The overhead cam allowed higher revving and more efficient combustion, producing approximately 3 horsepower from 49 cc, comparable to the output of an American flathead engine twice its size. The transmission was a 3-speed semi-automatic unit with a centrifugal clutch. You started the engine, twisted the throttle, and the machine went. You pressed the foot shift lever when you wanted more speed. If you forgot, the engine reminded you. The front suspension was telescopic 2 chrome tubes sliding inside 2 fixed tubes, providing perhaps 3 inches of travel over rough surfaces. The tires were 3.5 x 8 inches, larger than the Taco's wheels, providing more contact patch and better traction. The handlebars folded flat, allowing the machine to be placed in the trunk of a standard American car. The whole machine weighed 77 pounds heavier than a Taco by about 10 pounds, lighter by feel because the weight was lower and more centralized. The Honda was $250. A comparable Taco Frigiole was closer to $200, but the Frigiole offered nothing approaching the Z50A's mechanical sophistication. The comparative specifications were arithmetically undeniable. The Taco's flathead Tecumseh operated at a maximum of perhaps 4,500 revolutions per minute, producing its 3 to 5 horsepower through displacement rather than efficiency. The Z50A's overhead cam engine operated comfortably at 8,000 revolutions per minute, producing comparable power from a fraction of the displacement. The Taco ran 1 speed or 2 speeds through a centrifugal clutch. The Z50A ran 3 speeds through a system requiring minimal skill. The Taco's rigid frame transmitted every surface irregularity directly to the rider's spine. The Z50A's telescopic forks absorbed small variations that fill a Southern California suburban field. The Honda was, in the language that the mini-bike community would eventually develop, a different machine, not better in absolute terms, because the Taco had virtues of simplicity and robustness and the particular charm of things that are exactly what they appear to be, but better for the direction the market was moving. It was a machine that looked like a small motorcycle rather than a frame built around a lawnmower engine. It fit in the trunk of a car. It had the Honda name on it, and the Honda name, by 1968, carried associations: the Nicest People campaign, the dealer network, the reliability that Honda's street machines had established through a decade of American sales that the Taco could not match and had never attempted to. The rigid frame that could not bend. The structural limitation of the Taco was identical to its defining virtue. The machine was a rigid frame, flathead-engined, centrifugal clutch mini-bike, and it was those things with a consistency that allowed it to define a category. It was not trying to be a small motorcycle. That specificity was, for the first 8 years of production, exactly right. After 1968, it was insufficient. The rigid frame could have been replaced with a suspension-equipped frame. The flathead engine could have been replaced with an overhead cam design. Each of these changes would have required capital investment, new tooling, new manufacturing partnerships, and each would have produced a machine closer to the Honda Z50A in price, without matching it in the refinement that Honda's manufacturing system could achieve. The math was not encouraging. Steen Inc. had never been solely a mini-bike company, which gave John Steen a strategic flexibility that Rupp, primarily a mini-bike company trying to diversify, did not have. When the Z50A demonstrated in 1968 that the Japanese were competing in his market, Steen's pivot was already underway. The Hodaka distributorship, secured during his European trips in the mid-1960s, gave Steen's a Japanese-made motorcycle line to sell to the same customer base that had been buying tacos. But the taco itself could not pivot. It was a specific physical object made of specific materials by a specific manufacturing process, and the manufacturing process was built around the specific economics of a specific market that was changing. The competitors who could not adapt RUP would be effectively finished by 1974. The massive wave of knockoffs having crashed, and the Japanese machines having flooded the market, were companies whose entire identity was the machine. Steen's had always been a catalog company that made minibikes, among other things. The taco's end was not the company's end. The Kawasaki Coyote, introduced in the early 1970s, completed what the Honda Z50A had started. By the time both Japanese brands had established their minibike lines in America, the proposition of a flathead engine rigid frame machine with a centrifugal clutch was, for a family shopping for a child's first motorized vehicle, simply the less sophisticated option at a comparable price. The taco had shown that the category was real and the market was large. The Japanese manufacturers showed what it looked like when proper motorcycle engineering resources were applied to the same size machine. The last taco minibikes were assembled from existing parts inventory around 1971. There was no announcement. There was simply a trailing off of production as the parts ran out and the orders stopped arriving in quantities that justified reordering. The company, Steen's Incorporated, continued. John Steen continued. Motorcycle distribution, the Hodaka line, the synthetic oil business. The taco did not continue. The people who kept it running. The collector community that eventually organized around the taco minibike did not form quickly. The machines were abundant enough through the 1970s that they were not yet rare, common enough that anyone who wanted one could find one, cheap enough that the economic case for preservation was not obvious. They sat in garages, shed weight through rust and missing parts, were occasionally ridden by a new generation of children who did not know what they had, were occasionally sold to someone who would treat them with the care they deserved, and occasionally sold to someone who would not. The online communities that formed in the 1990s and early 2000s, oldminibikes.com was a center of gravity, changed the economics. What had been scattered information held in individual heads became collective, specific Tecumseh engine model numbers, correct paint formulas for the metallic purple that Wineland had inherited from his 1932 Ford Roadster, diff-frame geometry differences, distinguishing a 1963 taco from a 1969 taco, serial number ranges that allowed dating. The knowledge necessary to restore a taco to original specification existed, distributed across the community, waiting to be organized. The revival came in two forms. The online community around steenstacominibikes.com documented what had been made with scholarly attention that the original manufacturers had never applied to their own history. The physical revival came from Joe Ravello, a Southern California entrepreneur who acquired the taco name when the trademark was dormant in Texas and moved it back to Southern California, its birthplace, in Ravello's phrase around 2010. The new taco machines were not reproductions in the strict sense. The frame tubes were bent and smashed in the same places. The pleated vinyl seat maintained the same 1-inch depth. The colors referenced the original metallic palette, but modern coil-over shocks replaced the rigid frame's unmediated honesty, and a 6-horsepower overhead valve engine replaced the flathead Tecumseh. The spirit of the thing, Ravello argued, was more important than the specifications. The originals trade at prices that reflect the taco's position in American recreational history. A restorable taco frijole in documented original condition brings $1,500 to $3,000 depending on completeness. A fully restored example with correct paint and original engine commands more. The most desirable are the earliest frames, bearing the original metallic purple that came from Lynn Wineland's surplus roadster paint. The sites in Alhambra and Azusa where Steens Incorporated operated have been absorbed back into the industrial landscape of the San Gabriel Valley. There is no historical marker in Alhambra. The museum displays exist in the collections of individuals, in garages in Van Nuys and Fontana and Riverside, maintained by restorers who treat the machines with a care that their original owners did not and could not imagine. What survives most robustly is the community's specific technical knowledge and the specific sensory memory of a generation of Americans for whom the taco was the first machine. That memory does not require a museum. It is carried in the bodies of people now in their 60s and 70s who can still feel, without trying, what it was like to pull the start cord, hear the engine catch, and let the centrifugal clutch engage. Return to Alhambra. The parking lot on South Fremont Avenue in Alhambra that now occupies part of what was once Steens Incorporated does not know what it was. The San Gabriel Valley does not organize itself around its industrial history. It makes things and sells things and moves on to making and selling other things, which is exactly what John Steen did, starting with a consignment parts business, building through synthetic oil and go-karts and minibikes and Seriani forks and Hodaka motorcycles, always moving, always finding the next thing the market wanted. The pride in the taco was real and earned. The machine Steen designed in 1963 was the best available interpretation of a new recreational category, not the most sophisticated machine theoretically possible, but the most useful machine practically buildable from racing experience rather than formal engineering training, constrained by production cost and shipping economics.